I'm joined today by Dave Scola, Chief Executive U.S. at Form3 to discuss what's next in payments. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you again, Anaba.
It's a real pleasure. Dave, let's start by getting an assessment of the current state of payment innovation. I mean, in your view and with what the landscape looks like today, how do you see payments innovation? Can you highlight maybe some key trends and developments you've seen so far in 2023?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's been a trend for some time now where banks are looking to replace their legacy payments architecture. And I think that's been driven by a few dynamics. One being the desire to meet client demand for real-time payments, for enhanced data capture and transmission. I think to leverage some additional services on top of the payments. So the kind of creaking older legacy platforms that have been in place are really struggling to adapt to those new demands, particularly the demands of 24 by 7 for instant payments. And so, as I say, that dynamic's been in place for the last few years. I think what's accelerated it in 2023 has been the launch of FedNow, which I think has really forced banks to start to think about those that weren't already on TCH/RTP and are thinking about FedNow or had been trying to decide between both or either. It's really kind of forced their hand to address not only will they sign up for instant payments, but can their legacy platforms conform to the needs of what's required to do so. So that dynamic in 2023, I think, is leading to a lot of budgeting for innovation in 2024. And I think that in turn is driving a look at new technologies that can help facilitate those requirements, namely cloud. And I think more and more, it's not a new thing per se. I think banking has been looking at cloud for a while, but now looking at cloud for more core services, including their core platform, their payments gateway, things that would not have been considered for moving off premises in the past. And then beyond cloud, I think the other dynamic is really around microservices and really the ability to kind of have more control over the composition of their payments architecture. So that they can be more flexible and be quicker to market with new products, leveraging that kind of cloud and microservices environment, all of which is also brings APIs into Centerframe to facilitate the interaction of those core components. So those dynamics, I think, have been around for a little while, but 2023 has really seen their acceleration, and I think 2024 will be a year of adoption for many banks as they budget for their new payments architecture in the future.
And I mean, FedNow, as you said, is a big one. What about all the buzz around AI? Do you consider that one of the notable achievements in payment technologies? It's hard to have this, any payments innovation conversation without talking about AI and ML.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, certainly AI has been a tool, or machine learning at least has been a tool in the bank's quivers for some time. I think it's now a very trendy buzzword, right? I think it's the new blockchain to some extent, and I think in that same way, it's a tool looking for a problem in many cases. And that's not to be, I don't mean to come across as overly dismissive. I think there will be broad application of AI in the payment space in the future. I think the lowest hanging fruit for that, and from my perspective, is in the fraud space, where you're dealing with massive amounts of data. You're trying to find trajectories and models that are being replicated across the industry. That's impossible to do, obviously, with humans, let alone with traditional technologies. And I think AI opens up some new avenues for fraud analytics. And we're certainly looking into the application, and have been for a while actually, looking into the application of AI to fraud. But I think the broader application of AI and how it applies to payments is yet to be seen. But I think, obviously there will be uses for AI in payment streams going forward.
Dave, let's look at your top predictions. I mean, with the wealth of experience you have, what do you see, in the payments innovation space in 2024? I think you've touched on that a bit, but maybe delve a bit deeper into how you see the landscape evolving next year.
So I think next year, being relatively short term, I think you will see more and more banks looking to, as I've already said, looking more to adopt instant payments, particularly FedNow and RTP in the U.S. I think you'll start to see more use cases evolve around that. I mean, I don't think I'm alone in saying that the volumes expected to go through instant rails next year are not expected to be huge, right? And I think next year and probably into 2025 will be banks kind of onboarding and then starting to tentatively use instant. I think the longer term dynamic will be to what extent instant cannibalizes other rails that are in use today, primarily ACH. To some extent, it may cannibalize some card traffic. It may very well create new traffic, as we've seen in other markets. And I think some of that will be a function of the extent to which it's adopted by consumers as a mechanism of payment, right? And not only consumers, but merchants, right? And where we've seen success with instant payments in other markets, most notably in India and Brazil, has been really where it's been adopted as a valid mechanism of payment at point of sale at merchants, right? At shops and at, coffee shops and you name it, right? I think we're a long way off from that in the U.S. There's a couple of things that have to happen, namely the establishment of alias directories and, the use of QR codes. I think will all kind of accelerate that if it happens at all. But that's kind of the prediction in the instant payment space. I think in payments in general, beyond just instant, it's really this continued dynamic of payments being embedded into other transactional activities. So it becomes a much more natural consequence of whatever a consumer or a business is engaged in. The output is a payment, but that is a composite of, or a component rather, of the broader activity that they're trying to accomplish.
Dave, what about open banking? I mean, there's been some movement this year in terms of how, UK, we talk often about the UK. How do you see that landscape evolving in the US specifically when it comes to open banking?
Yeah, I think it's the establishment of open banking standards in the UK happened a few years ago, if I'm correct. And I think it's taken some time to proliferate into actual use cases and companies. We don't have the same open banking standards here in the U.S., but I think as a, potential midway solution to that, we are seeing the increased use of APIs and the mechanism of APIs as a mechanism of exchange between platforms and between microservices. And I think you'll start to see that continue to proliferate. But, is that truly open banking? I think there's some arguments there that, you still have banks with a much stronger hold on their existing client base. And I don't see that changing that dramatically in the near future until there's more kind of regulatory structure around how we do that.
Awesome. Dave, let's shift a bit to cross-border payments and globalization, another space that has also, seen a lot of movements in the past year. What I mean, still, having this forward-looking view, what are some of the trends you see shaping the future of cross-border payments, in next year, which is a couple of months away?
Yeah, so I mean, the cross-border payment space is dominated, still continues to be dominated by Swift, right? And in full disclosure, I am a former Swiftie myself, so I have to give that warning. But I think Swift does, to give Swift its due, it does a good job in helping facilitate the traditional correspondent banking methodology of cross-border payments, to the point where, most payments are settled within 5 minutes. And I think they're up to now, it's 100% of all payments are settled within 24 hours. That said, I do think that there is this desire to look at how we can network uh, domestic payment schemes with each other, right? I think we've seen the EBA come out with a statement around how that could be accomplished. I think, Bank of England has also looked at that. Um, in the U.S., I think we're further behind just because we're further behind in
Yeah.
the instant payment journey in general. I don't think that will happen in the U.S. until the Fed comes out with some structure and regulations around how that could be accomplished. But I do think the longer term view is that we'll start to see a movement away from traditional correspondent banking via Swift to potentially these kind of internetworked real-time payment schemes. Or alternatively, right, that there is still a whole use case for DLT and tokens as a mechanism of exchange cross-border. They've been discussed for a while. Nothing's really taken hold as yet, but that doesn't mean it never will. So I continue to think that if there is a use case for, tokens, whether it be CBDCs or some other non-fiat mechanism of exchange, we may see that first happen in the cross-border space where the use case is a little more clear.
Looking at currency conversion, challenges and all these regulatory differences, how do you think international payment providers are adjusting to that and having to address that challenge?
Yeah, and that is the big challenge, right? Is it's very easy to move a message cross border, right? It's far more difficult to achieve actual settlement, and I think that calls into question both the FX rate, right, and the transparency of the FX rate at the point of the payment initiation. It calls into question the spreads that are being taken against the FX rate. And it also calls into question the liquidity, right? So I think how liquidity moves cross-border is still the big question around things like networking individual real-time payment schemes, right? You still, at the end of the day, have to move dollars to pounds or dollars to euros or what have you. And how that is achieved is still unclear. And I think again, that's where the kind of the potential for tokens or CBDCs, potentially solves for some of that liquidity. I think there's a whole host of other questions around that, but could potentially solve for some of that cross currency conversion. But it's still, it's still an area where there's an enormous number of questions that still need to be answered from a regulatory perspective, and from a technical perspective. The technical questions, frankly, are much easier to solve for than the regulatory and liquidity questions.
But even if the technical is solved, it still it hinges on regulation, right?
Exactly.
Which kind of stalls the process, don't you think so?
Yeah, no, I think, you need consensus among markets around how this will be handled. Could you potentially leverage something like a CLS as an intermediary in the same way it's being used now for RTGS transactions? I think it will take a level of regulatory cohesion that I don't see
Mm,
happening in the near future, right? I think there's a lot of other domestic
yeah.
payment solutions that need to be solved for first before those kind of broader international payment solutions are solved. That said, I mean, we shouldn't discount some of the work that's being done in, um, I'll say, smaller markets, right? Smaller, more dynamic markets. I look at what's happening between Singapore and some of the Southeast Asian economies and the attempts to network there. Africa, similarly, there's attempts to kind of network. LATAM, we've seen
Mhm.
the potential expansion of PIX, which is the Brazilian instant payment scheme, to potentially to other countries. So I think we could start to see regional blocks start to form connectivity between their instant payment systems and start to solve for some of the liquidity issues on a smaller basis. And that may well serve as the foundation for broader global integration in the future.
I think you sort of answered my question. That sort of thinking about innovations and still in the cross-border infrastructure space that can simplify global transactions. Because at the end of the day, it's all about simple, cheaper, faster, right? That's where the goal is.
Yeah, and I think you also need to look at the use cases, right? I think we're all very focused on instant payments and the value
Mm,
of getting value conveyed instantly to the end beneficiary. But then you look at the use cases for cross border, and is there quite the same level of
mm,
demand or need, right? Certainly, global trade calls for the need for faster, quote unquote,
yeah.
faster payments, not
Mm,
necessarily instant, right?
instant. Yeah.
Um, but we'll see it, and that's something I think we tend to lose focus on as solution providers, and I'll throw myself in that bucket, right? Is look at what a great technology we have. We can help you achieve
Mm,
this, these solutions leveraging instant payments, but we lose focus of, well, does the client actually want that, need it, is willing to pay for it, right? I think those use cases we need to remember are paramount and need to drive the investment and the utilization of these rails at the end of the day.
mm. Dave, as we wrap up, what does 2024 look like at Form 3?
2024 looks very promising.
Mm,
We've just announced a great partnership with Visa. We are gaining an enormous amount of traction in the U.S. I think we're also seeing a lot of the transaction banking and corporate banking
mm,
businesses are kind of flush with cash, driven off the back of the interest rate increase, which has driven NII revenues, and there's a clear demand to reinvest some of those revenues in payment systems to make sure that the banks are well positioned for what's coming in the future. So, and I think we are emblematic of what most people see as the new architectural paradigm, which is, again, leveraging cloud and microservices and API to create a much more nimbler and more dynamic payments infrastructure so that they can build new products and new services off the back of that. So it's looking good. But
okay.
check in with me in a few months and we'll see.
We'll definitely do. That's less than 2 months away, so I'm sure we'll
Can't
catch up
believe
and
it.
know what. Yeah, I know time is flying fast. But thank you so much, Dave. Thanks for making the time today. Great insights there. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Oheb. I really appreciate the time.